Hi, this is DJ James from musicmoose.org, getting back to some things dealing with applied music theory for the guitar. Some of the earlier lessons where I've been talking about some theoretical concepts, things with music theory that a lot of times, especially as practicing musicians, we lose sight of, or we begin to play and never really kind of go back and learn the theory, which in a lot of times can enrich our playing in a lot of ways. And today I want to get into the theory of the tritone substitutions. I know a lot of players know exactly what they're doing with the tritone substitutions, but they don't really know why it works. And that's one thing I want to explain. But for those of you who don't know what a tritone substitution, is, hopefully I can explain that for you and give you a good sense of why it's cool and why we should be using it more. We're going to start with the standard 2-5-1 progression in C. D minor 7, G7, to C major 7. Now, what is the tritone substitution? Well, the first rule of the tritone substitution is you can only use it with a dominant chord. So in that 2-5-1 progression, the only place where we can use it is for this G7, because we have a D minor 7 and then a G7, which is a dominant. And how do we know it's a dominant? Well, a dominant chord is going to have the major third and yet a minor 7th, which is what gives us that sound. Again, this is basic music theory or a review for those of you who are not quite sure on this, or if you don't know it, that's exactly what the dominant chord is. You'll always see it written as just the letter and then the 7. So the tritone substitution works for any dominant 7th chord. There are ways to sort of fudge it when playing minor 7 chords or major 7 chords, but in general, when we mention tritone substitutions, we're dealing with a dominant 7th chord. The theory behind the tritone substitution goes back to our ever-present and ever-famous ubiquitous guide tones, which I've been talking about a whole lot on Music Moose, and that's because they're incredibly important. Let's take a look at the guide tones then to this dominant 7th chord, to this G7, and for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to play it a little bit lower on the neck instead of way up high here. Our standard G7 voicing, which we're generally going to play in when we're playing rhythm, looks something like this. And that's a standard 3-note G7 voicing with the G, F, and B. Where are our guide tones in that? Well, our guide tones are on the F and the B. Now, for our tritone substitutions, what we're essentially doing is taking another dominant 7th chord that has the exact same guide tones. And the reason that it's called there are two reasons why it's called a tritone substitution. The first of all being that guide tones on a dominant 7th chord always form a tritone, F and B. Now, for those of you who don't know what a tritone is also known as the augmented 4th or the diminished 5th. We call it a tritone because there are 3 whole tones between the 2 notes of a tritone. So, for instance, if we go from the F to the B here in our G7, we have F to G, which is 1 whole tone, G to A, 2, and A to B, 3 tones. So that's our tritone, F to B. So there's our G7. Now, if we take a look at that, there's another chord which has the exact same tritones, or has the exact same guide tones, excuse me, another dominant chord with the exact same guide tones, and it is the C sharp 7. The top 2 notes of those voicings are the same. They're going to be spelled differently, and I'll get to that in a second, but for right now, we can just sort of think of those as being the same, the top 2 notes in those voicings, G7 to C sharp 7. The other reason that we call this a tritone substitution is if we look at the bass notes there, they're a tritone apart. And the tritone there being G to A to B, B to C sharp. 2 reasons why we call it a tritone substitution, because those guide tones sit a tritone apart, and also because the roots are going to sit a tritone apart. Now, if we use the tritone substitution, let's take a look at it in practice. We've got this D minor 7 in our 2-5-1 progression, going to the G7, or let me play the G on the bass note so you can hear it a little bit more. I have to admit that's a habit of mine to play the 5th, to hold on to the 5th there, because like I said, in jazz, the bassist always has the root. But let me play the root for you so you get a better sense of that. And then to our tonic. What we can do, since the guide tones, again, the two most important notes in that G7 chord, since the guide tones are the same as they would be for a C-sharp 7 chord, we can substitute a C-sharp 7 chord for that G7 and essentially create what is now, instead of a diatonic line going from a diatonic bass line going from D to G to C, now with that tritone substitution, we get a chromatic descending bass line, which in some ways is a little bit hipper and a little stronger as well. So let me play that for you. There's our D minor 7, our C sharp 7, to a C major 7. So the difference there being that bass line versus, it again comes down to a matter of preference, comes down to a matter of the soloist, what kind of harmony the soloist likes using. It's really up to you when you want to use the tritone substitution, but just be aware that it's always available. Versus and we can use that all over the place. We go back to some rhythm changes, which is something that I worked on in an earlier lesson. We can now throw a tritone substitution in there. And even when we then play the second part of the eighth section, so now the first time through that rhythm changes, or the standard bass line of that version of the rhythm changes, now we get a chromatic descending bass line. Which, if you use it too much, starts to make it sound like you're playing for Tin Pan Alley. But if you use it sparingly, use it tastefully, it's a very cool sound and will completely enrich your ability to comp behind soloists, and will completely enrich your ability as an arranger, as a composer, as someone who can just play the guitar. For musicmoose.org, this is DJ James.